All right, so hi everybody. Hope it's going well. My name is Nahla Tabba. I'm one of the co-founders of Forsa School, along with Rania Jishi from Naqd and the team at Sharjah Art Foundation. And what Forsa School is really this, this combination of many issues and challenges we've been facing in the creative industry, specifically in the UAE. And we've called on different tutors across our community to come and help us address these matters. We're very honored to have Saira Ansari here with us as well. So Saira is a researcher and a writer who focuses on South Asian art history and publishing. She currently works in research and publications at Sharjah Art Foundation, but has contributed to many publications across the region. And I was fortunate enough to participate in a talk with Saira hosted by Kevin Jones at Tashkil last year, where we spoke about our alternative art practices and learning about both Saira's career and her trajectory as a craftsman and an artist when it comes to writing was incredibly inspiring, because what you reminded us of essentially was this idea of trying to be lighthearted and really pushing the boundaries of creative writing, even in more formal pockets and situations. So Saira, I'll leave it to you to begin. And for anybody who has any questions for Saira, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and Saira will address them in the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nahla. That was quite a lovely introduction. I really enjoyed that session with you too, and I'm glad you kind of got to the crux of what I was trying to do with that presentation. I'd like to thank the Forsa School and the Sharjah Art Foundation team for putting this together, and to everyone who's joined us today. It's been an interesting few days of speaking with art professionals and my peers, and the workshop 2 days ago was something that I really, really enjoyed. So my apologies to people from the workshop who are back again, because there's going to be plenty of repeated material, but it is like a condensed diet soda version, condensed into 40 minutes. So stick around, because it might be a helpful reminder of what we discussed. And in the interest of time and to get the best out of the session, I will be switching between reading from my notes and improv speaking. It helps me a lot, because while I enjoy and I'm confident in writing, when I speak, I kind of tend to stumble and eat my words.
It's all good.
So my session is titled Writing as Practice. It is both addressing artists and it is not. Really, at the end of it, many of these tips can help a lot of people with their writing. But with artists, the added burden of having to speak about your work is intense. I do not believe that I can ease that journey, but I can only speak about my journey and the tools I use. And I hope in sharing them, you find that my tools can just as easily be your tools. As Nahla introduced, I am a writer and a researcher. I have a studio background, both by bachelor's and master's degree, or in visual arts, with lots of studio time thrown in. And text has always played a very important part in my work and in my practice. Over the last decade, I started leaning on writing as my true expression. But for years, and even now, people ask me, what happened to your art? I'm a writer. That is my art. I am what they call me in the UAE, a non-native English speaker. When I speak, my accent is as desi as it gets. I'm a brown girl who went to school in Pakistan. What is my accent supposed to be? I mix my V's and W's all the time, and I eat my words when I talk fast. But when I write, that is my space and where I'm the most confident. And I join you all today to speak about how writing and all its manifestations really can be a part of your practice. I will be showing some examples of text that I've enjoyed, followed by some of my own work, if time permitting. And I will also briefly discuss what I learned from the really incredibly enriching experience of the workshop that we were a part of 2 days ago. And I hope that through this discussion, I am able to communicate to you a few things that would help you be more authentic and confident in your own writing, and especially be aware of the tools you should be employing to get better or improve. So, I mean, if you read the brief of the talk, we kind of focus on what is creative nonfiction. So what does it mean to write? Anything, a diary, a dream journal, financial accounts of the home, press releases, artist texts, exhibition essays, letters to a lover, to an enemy, shared words written for the world, hidden words written for you. I have no doubts that many of you are familiar with the term creative nonfiction, but for the sake of the talk, I will explain briefly. Creative nonfiction is a genre of writing where you work with a rich mix of ideas, styles, techniques, and with the end goal of producing a factually correct text, sometimes very thoroughly researched, which essentially is about real people and real events, but presented in a very captivating manner. I mean, you may have come across it in travel writing, for instance, or in published letters, but it can be so much more than that. It can be an essay, it can be an article, a research paper, a memoir, a poem. It can be personal or not, or it can be all of those together. What it does do is it employs a full range of your voice, and it allows you to take liberties. And I'm going to talk a lot about creative liberties today. And it allows you to take liberties with the content, to tug and push, and really to become something that truly represents your unique voice. As artists, you may use it as a tool, as an extension of your work, breaking the limitations of singular discipline. So, very little do people now say that I am just a photographer, just a painter. Interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary are terms that many of us are now using because our practices kind of expand that way. So you can use the text to not only be a part of your visual work, but also strengthen your practice if you make films or music or a performer and so on. The freedom of breaking sentences, words, letters, and structures, and interspersing your essay over an A4 sheet like it's a blank canvas, writing as if you are speaking aloud, introducing visual markers, these all help to bring shape to a text that is creative. And I'm not saying you should use all of them together because that would be a kitchery, or cross that kind of blurry line between what is a piece of text that is meant to be published or that which is a work of art. I mean, which you can do if you want. I'm no one to really draw lines or judge, but knowing when and how to play with words is truly what is liberating and what the honing the skill is all about. A factual text written as a vivid story should be able to connect with people on an emotional and personal level. And because of that element, there is a chance it might only connect with a few people and not everybody. And that's okay, because unless absolutely intended, you're not meant to write for everyone. And not everyone will care about your experiences. And that is something that you have to learn to live with. So what we're focusing on now is how as writers, we use creative practices in our text and to benefit from them. And I understand that many of you within this panel, I can't see all of you. Hopefully when the conversation starts and I can see your images, I know who joined in. But from the workshop, what my experience was that majority of the people who joined in are not people who identify as writers, even if they are using writing. But kind of in the microcosm of this Zoom session, we are conversing now as peers and as writers, and that's how we will see ourselves. So I address you as writers and how we should look at ourselves and what should we consider before writing. A large percentage of participants from my workshop identified with certain similarities. Non-native English speakers, children of the diaspora, coming from a range of immigrant experiences, juggling with ideas of identity, belonging, and home. And these are very important themes, and I'm sure they resonate with a lot of you. But I like to think that we can use these experiences to inform our writing in a slightly subtler way, not in a very obvious way, not necessarily feed the cliches that are so generic that really the text could have been written by any other person, or even an outsider that's trying to stereotype you. And so when I say, who are we? I would firmly like to establish that I don't mean beginner level struggles of identity we all face when we started painting or writing or in art school. I think we want to find in the art schools and journals. Identifying yourself beyond that is the act of understanding your voice. Learn to identify what makes you and your voice uniquely you. Who are you right now? Who are you tomorrow? Who were you yesterday? Who are you not? Sometimes the absence of identity markers is a very clear marker of who you are. What it does is that it adds depth to your narrative. Use and explore facets of your interest to kind of inject that into your writing. So it's a really silly thing, but I can say that I'm from Lahore. But if I want to write an authentically Saira experience of growing up, I would probably write about a street called Nawazish Lane in Cantonment, which a lot of people might not know. But I think that brings my story to who am I and how that one street shaped who I became. And when I say who are we, I would firmly like to establish that, you know, I guess I've said that, but just kind of get rid of typical questions of identity. I'm sorry, I know it sounds very harsh, but I would like for us to move beyond those conversations that we see in a lot of juries and critical sessions that we discuss. And a large part of this is actually deeply connected to where are we, which is an exercise in locating ourselves. So sure, I'm right now in Sharjah in the UAE, and that may not be enough. Locating yourself is much more than that. It is your mental and physical presence in the now. The references in your text are enriched when there is context, whether you speak from a position of authority or of inexperience, whether you sit within the walls you critique or feel the texture of mud in your mouth when you come out of a fight and write about it. So sensorial details like light, the sound, the feel, they kind of help connect the reader to what you're talking about. You know, it helps draw them into your own world. But again, locating yourself is so much more than that. A majority of us non-native English speakers spend our time explaining, translating, contextualizing our experiences for the other. All of you are probably familiar with this. We do this in italics, in parentheses, in footnotes. We will write chai and we'll write it in italics, and in brackets, we'll write tea. I mean, fine, it doesn't happen with chai anymore, but with a lot of words that we write about. But we do it in unnecessarily stretched paragraphs, explaining details that sadly take away from our narrative. And we break our flow because we think we need to justify what we're talking about. So if as an Arab or a Desi, you are writing very specifically for an audience who does not know you, and I don't know how many of those audiences exist anymore, fine, then use those tools. But when you write about you or your work or the work you observe, learn to take ownership of your words, your phrases, your reality. Learn to stop and locate yourself. You're not serving everyone. You're only serving those who you invite into the sphere from which you write. The location of yourself helps with rewriting words, terms, experiences that make your text very authentically yours. And I will provide a few examples further on when I read out from certain other texts. This leads to the next point that I've written. What do we fear? And I didn't realize how important this would become when I was doing the workshop, because it kind of really becomes one of the most important things we talked about. Because almost all of us, at whatever level we're working, we fear something. Mostly it's of judgment and criticism, or of being thought not good enough, and a lot of times of being misunderstood. And more often than not, this fear is what really stops us from writing our best text, just simply because we were too afraid to try or to experiment. And so this fear is really in front of us in this large, weird, bulbous kind of shape. It's like a cloud, doesn't have clear features. We're afraid, but we're not able to identify what it is that we're afraid of. And so we end up fearing everything and not really doing anything. And one of the exercises.
Sorry, what you were saying about how people started to ask you where your art was, and that transition into writing and kind of boldly saying, but my writing is my practice. How did you manage to also overcome that fear?
So I think a lot of it came out of very antagonistic kind of responses, because when I was writing a lot of the text, especially in my master's, I started engaging with institution critique, which obviously is an idea of the 70s, but for me, it was brand new. I didn't even know that term. And so mine was a more reactionary response, where I fought for my text to be included in my work. But more and more, I just felt more comfortable writing. And I always I just never felt that it was different from any other expression that I was making. And for the longest time, I didn't know how to kind of make peace with that. And I wrote artist and writer. And then I was like, no, I'm a writer. That is my art. And I think I had to come to a point where I realized I don't care what anybody thinks, because I, again, am producing for myself. And so it really doesn't matter what I identify with at the end of the day. This could change tomorrow, really. Yeah, so I wouldn't associate that with fear. I think my fear is the same fears that everybody has. What am I writing? Is this any good? Does this communicate anything that I'm writing? And I think one of the exercises that I spoke about in the workshop, in which I wanted to kind of mention with what do we fear, is it's a very simple exercise. It's almost like something a therapist would give you, but I would really advise people to write down what they're fearing when they're writing. Most of it's very obvious. Is it good enough? Will it come across as authentic? Do I make myself clear? Now, if there's issues of simple things like spelling and grammar, really, that's a different kind of fear. That's a skill you need to work on. You need to hone on the skill. But when you're talking about content and self-expression, I think it's about the more you write, the more you understand and develop a style, and you get confident, and you need to rationalize what you are fearing and what is that fear justified. And if it is, then how do you address it? If it's not, then you write it away. And if you stop writing for people and just start without the fear of even showing it, a lot of things kind of change with that. And keeping kind of all of these parameters in mind, I think when we start writing text of any sort, whether industrial standard text or creative text, we must decide on what we want to project. Because as with a drawing or a painting, with the final image is the same with an essay. And once the writing begins or the first draft is finished, the writer must focus on what the final outcome is. What is it that you're trying to project? What is the purpose of your text, and what does it hope to communicate? When you're taking creative liberties within your text, you have the option to be as direct or as obscure as you want, but recognize that intention and see if your text reflects that. And a badly written text cannot simply be excused by saying I intended it to be abstract, because it doesn't work, and that comes across.
About that, actually. So what do we want to project? Is that the same as identifying your audience and knowing your audience, or are you talking about something much bigger than that?
So one of the next things that I was kind of mentioning is, who do we write for? I don't think what you want to project is part of what your audience is. Projection is a clarity of a concept. This is all what I think. Obviously, this is not the gospel. This could be wrong. This is what I think. I think it's important how you want to project a certain text. And then, who we write it for can either come before you start writing or after you start writing. But more often than not, unless it's an exercise in automatic writing or completely impulsive writing, you have an idea of what you're writing. And while you're focusing on all the other location markers of how your voice is true to it, or where you're locating yourself, you want to know what that vision of that text is. If you're intending it to be playful, you want to know if it's projecting across to someone who's reading it. So honestly, projection is mostly for text that will have an audience beyond you, right? So it's important to know then what the text is being written for. So if it has an intended audience, or if it's been commissioned by someone, there is an end goal. And so the text needs to achieve that. And so by way of whatever you're doing, whether you're doing gibberish, whether you're scrolling, but that is the end goal, you can separate from what the text is and what it achieves to do. I don't know if that's, there's a few examples that I'll show later that maybe perhaps explain all of these. So in the case of, for instance, if you're writing a review or an essay for an art publication, the context of the text, your stance, your interpretation needs to be very clear, and it's something the reader can approach. But it comes to, for example, if you're doing an extended creative image caption or an artist statement for the viewers of an artwork in an exhibition, the parameters slightly change. Yes, you are reaching an audience, but it's a more personal text, and the communication angle might remain similar, but how you are communicating can change. So when we're working on what image the text is projecting, establishing your audience helps tighten the narrative. So if your intention is still to be abstract or obscure, even when an unknown audience is out there, justify the reason to do so and then do it, but then stick to the promised goal, whether it is something that you've discussed with an editor or something that you promised yourself that the text is meant to achieve. And finally, there are texts that you write for yourself. It's part of an artwork, or it's something that you're not interested in sharing that may or may not find an audience, but then that the audience is not the end goal. For you, then it becomes an exercise, whether it's an artistic exercise or really just venting and writing. But at the end of it, if you ever intend to make it publicly accessible, even if it's to 2-3 people, it will eventually and inevitably reach an audience other than you. And that is worth considering. Again, if you choose to leave them in the dark, that is your choice, but it should come with an intention and not an accident. I think the examples I'll show later might help clarify some of these things. So I think I've covered some of the points about creative nonfiction, but just in comparison, there's some basic requirements to consider when writing different kinds of texts. So, writing is an art practice, writing is play, writing as play can be employed in both cases, but when you're writing for professional kind of platforms, for art publications, for exhibition catalogs, you can employ all of the techniques of creative nonfiction, but there's certain things to consider. The conversation starts with the person who commissions you. So it's a commissioning editor or an artist. There is a purpose to what the text has to achieve. It has to be prepared for a specific audience. So then you play within those parameters of achieving that goal, which is possible. But one of the things that's very important that you can probably ignore in your own work, but when you're working with kind of commercial standards, is there's no compromise on the standards of writing. You must actually choose something that is coherent, that is clear, that there's no bad spelling, bad phrasing, all of those kind of grammatical and structural and formatting things. Unless it's intentional, that's separate. But I cannot state enough how incredibly disrespectful it is to a couple of things. One, turn in a text that is completely shoddy. You are wasting the time of others and you have really not done your job. So I'm kind of moving away from creative nonfiction and just going to the basics and saying, don't ever do that. That's not respectable and it's wasting the time of another person. So really clean your text. And I'll kind of move that on the next slide where we discuss on how you're going to work on that text. But the other thing is also that you must commit to what you have discussed with your editor. So if you have various ideas, you discuss them with the editors. And not all editors are same. Some are completely difficult to work with, but some are really, really a joy to work with. And some of my favorite texts of mine, oh, that sounds incredibly all wrong, but some of the texts that I love mine are the ones that I've done with a couple of editors that I really, really love, who were able to pull out within my text without changing my format, my playfulness. They weren't saying, why are you writing everything in small letters, or why is suddenly everything indented or sentences broken? They were able to say, you discuss something in the first page and you come to something in the 5th page and I'm drawing very interesting parallels to them. So why don't you join them together and develop an argument? Those are the kind of feedbacks that you should be able to accept and work with, especially when you've committed to like a commercial exercise. But how you can play with commercial work, for example, if you are writing for an exhibition catalog and you are invited with multiple writers. So you understand that everybody's covering an angle and there's something that you can pitch and say, I'm going to play around with this. But if you're writing about a solo exhibition, you're the only writer, how much can you play with and not compromise the artist's integrity in the writer? So remember when to pull in and when to pull out, how much of you is required and how much of you needs to pull back. You can still keep a lot of your authentic self in these texts, but learn the integrity of what the text is meant to achieve.
I mean, Saira, that's why it's so important to stick to those deadlines, right? Because it is allowing those interruptions or conversations to happen with your editor. Once something, is beyond late, you don't even have the chance to make it a collaborative thing. Actually.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought it up because this is something we discussed in the workshop. It's very important to meet deadlines, not just for the sake of that somebody's losing their bloody mind trying to get a schedule together, but also it gives you and the editor time to talk about text and really gives life to your text because of the back and forth. When there's a lot of rush, you really don't realize the great potential your text could have been. Really, you are only as great as the feedback that you're willing to accept and the critical kind of intake that you take with your text. So it's very important. I know we romanticize writing last minute deadlines. There's nothing romantic about it, especially with other people working with you. So being creative does not mean you cannot be a professional. You can be an all-nighter writer, and that's fine. Do what works for you. But respecting other people's time is a professional requirement that should not be taken away if you're a creative person. And I cannot say that enough, having worked on both the receiving end of text and submitting myself. And I'm awful. I've been awful with deadlines in so many projects in my life. And I've learned the hard way that you lose people's respect. They will not trust you if you don't deliver. And I've gotten some chippers in my life and, a lesson well learned. So what happens when you've kind of figured out who you are and you've kind of figured out what kind of writing you're doing? A few things to think about when writing. I'm not going to give like an ABC again or basic things. I'm just going to mention a few things that I think are extremely important when you write any kind of text, but especially kind of creative nonfiction where you're already thinking you're so much ownership of it as your artwork that you're already afraid to get feedback on. An introduction. Intro is the key. It is everything. And it is not everything in very obvious ways. So for instance, if you're writing a press release, yes, your introduction has to be super concise. Your first paragraph should be able to reach out and say, what is the exhibition? Who is the artist? What are the new works? Where it is? Because your audience are press people. They receive hundreds of press releases a day. They do not have the time of day to go through your conceptual text to figure out what's happening. They'll get bored, they'll chuck it. The intention of the press release is lost. So that's another kind of an introduction. With fiction, creative nonfiction, with reportage, maybe not so much with poetry, but with every other prose narrative, the introduction is the way of the hook to try and grab the person. So you're not necessarily giving all the information. Actually, you're not giving all of the information anyway. You're making people hold on. You're taking them into a journey till the end of your last sentence to tell them what you're writing about. So be very careful about how you begin something. An introduction can change 50 times. You can start with something and it will change halfway through the text or when you finish the text. So learn to go back and change things. Things become very precious. So that's a word that we use in art school. Your painting has become very precious. You have worked on it so hard and it's at a stage which you're not quite sure, but you're afraid to touch it because it might go bad. You have to let go of that. The same with text. You have to be able to look at what you've written and decide if it's working or not, which is where I write edit, edit, edit. You need to cut / remove all through your text without fear, without any kind of hesitation. You should learn to be your own best and worst kind of judge. And remember that texts do not necessarily need to drag on. Unless you're giving a word count report to your professor, that's a completely different thing. But learn that dragging on, even if you sense it a little bit, the other person will sense it too. So edit as much as you can. Be very brave with it. But then sometimes it becomes really hard. You can take a break, come back, it becomes hard. Where critical feedback comes in. So at this stage, you talk to peers, you talk to people around you who are, in your opinion, you think are skilled in what you want them to look at. Do not go to friends. Your friends are your doing is great, it's beautiful, it's amazing. That does not help you. You can seek that validation at any time. But if you really want to develop critical text, you need to seek out people who you know will give you honest feedback and not worry about hurting your feelings. Now, whether you take that feedback or not is totally your choice. Nobody's saying you have to accept it, but you have to seek that feedback, because sometimes people who are outside the box of what you're writing will be able to see something in a text that you're missing out. So, for instance, your intention was not to be obscure at all, but your text is super disconnected from what you're trying to say. A critical feedback of sorts might be able to identify that, which is what an editor also does, which I'll come to later. Once you've done the editing, once you've done critical feedback, I think self-critique is very important to kind of reevaluate what you write and learn to delete. Learn to delete, really. Learn to discard also. After that, now the last stage, which I write, edit again, is working with professional editors. Now, I know this is not something that is affordable for everybody, and it's not something that we think about, but really it's not very expensive either, especially if you think of publishing this in a book format or online or digital or in a journal. Seeking a proper editor's opinion or feedback will be essential to you putting out something good. And that's something to consider. You can seek out people who can help you for an exchange of services you give them or a fee. Try and pay people. You might not have a lot of money, but they might also not have a lot of money. So again, respect relationships, but seek out professionals that may be able to help you. Yeah, so one of the things that I quickly wanted to mention before I move on was know your medium. One of the things we learn in art school that may be considered very old school and debatable, but something that I stand by and I've seen work in real life, is take the example of a drawing or a painting. Now, I'm not a purist, and I think everyone can do whatever they want to. But if we are to engage in some kind of critical discussion, then the advice goes. If you are to make an abstract image, know how the elements work before you take them apart. If you know how the human figure is drawn correctly anatomically, then breaking its joints and limbs and features become a more knowledgeable exercise. Making terrible doodles and using the abstract style as an excuse shows. You can choose to agree with me or not. That's totally fine. That is the kind of advice I'm offering right now. However, knowing the medium of words and expressions thoroughly helps when breaking it up and taking creative liberties with writing. It allows you to play with words in a way that signal that the spelling mistakes, the lack of punctuation, and the strange phrasing that you're now using is deliberate. You're doing that knowingly, and it means something. It makes the piece that much stronger. So respect your medium, and then feel free to abuse it. And one of the things I haven't added here is, I've talked about respecting professionals and respecting your medium. I think it's very important to respect your readers and your audience. We don't give them enough credit. We dumb them down. We are from a world which says press releases and statements should be understandable by all. And so we really dumb it down so much. Doesn't matter. If you write something and it has a small audience, it's fine. But learn to respect that your audience may understand. And in that same way, can also identify when you're faking it, when you're making really bad abstract text or paintings. Again, not trying to judge, but saying if you want to be in a critical dialogue, you need to learn to accept that. So I want to quickly go through 3 texts that I find very interesting as examples of what I've been discussing so far. And I think things like locating yourself, finding yourself, and those are kind of going to get identified a little bit more strongly. Are we doing good on time?
Yeah. We are good on time, so we'll take questions around in about 7 minutes. Good?
Give me 10. Okay, so quickly we're going to look at the State, which was a homegrown journal that was published out of Dubai and had a very interesting editorial board of writers, editors, artists, which was Ahmed Makia, Rahel Aimal, Lanchin Shir, Raja Khaled, kind of rotating roster. This particular issue was edited by Deepak Onikrishnan, who a lot of people in the UAE, if you've been part of any talks or any kind of sessions, know about him. He's a fantastic writer, and he teaches at the NYU Abu Dhabi. And so he was the guest editor on it. And I've tried to repeat the people in the 3 samples so I can kind of explain what I meant with your peers and how they're writing. So Makia was with me in Campus Art Dubai a long time ago. I think it was the 2nd edition. And that Campus Art Dubai was looking at people bringing in their their texts, which were unfinished texts, and talking about them and getting critical feedback, which is very helpful. And this particular text really stayed with me. It was called Garhood This Way. So it's a really well-researched factual paper into the location that was Garhood, and I can't remember the word, but anyway, everything that Makia kind of put into what this location meant, what the school district was, what grew there, who were the people who lived there, the demographics, and then, but he presented it with his voice and with personal anecdotes that really make it stand out. So I'm just going to read quickly a bit. In 2000, the year everything changed, yet few remember. A gigantic pink building appeared. Freightworks. It was built across the row of schools and was the first export from the east into the Western Educational District. It looked like an obese sponge. I could see the building from my classroom window at Al Mawaqib, and sometimes I'd imagine blowing it up. Why? I'm still unsure. A few months after the sponge appeared, a gas station was built behind my school, Enoch. Almost every day, neighboring school children went there during recess or after class ended. Some of Dubai's greatest stories will come from this place and will be published once the most representative language has been found. This particular station became a major site of petty corruption in the Eastern District. Schools hired Enoch workers to inform the administrations if any of their respective pupils identified by school uniforms were found at the station during school hours, especially during recess when most students would plot their trips. Students responded by visiting the station in wife beaters. They didn't bother changing out of their school-issued trousers because Enoch's workers found it difficult to tell school trousers apart. They all looked the same, black, dark blue, or mahogany. Trousers of poor quality were also infected by color fade, taking on the color of rust after exposure to too much sun. Eventually, the schools mimicked National Charity School solution. Everyone built higher walls and installed barbed wire to curtail the escapes. And I think this is really interesting in how he's writing a report about Garhood, but this kind of feeds into the histories of how Dubai was developing. And there's a whole group of Dubai kids who remember this experience, who remember these schools, remember these stories, and the fact that it's being put into while he's mapping Garhood. And most of the essay is peppered with his hand-drawn drawings of neighborhoods. He could have used images of maps, but this is a very clear example of how he's injected his voice and his experiences into a retelling of an area. Quickly moving on, now I'm back to Deepak Onikrishnan and the book that we all know, which is Temporary People. Deepak Onikrishnan is a South Indian whose parents moved here for work, and so Deepak grew up here, went to school here, went abroad to study, and came back. And he writes very specifically about the South Indian experience. In my mind, I see this book as magical realism. And I think when I discuss this with Deepak, he doesn't like to use that term. But he builds upon real factual stories to build completely fictionalized short stories and plays with the back and forth of what the reality of Gulf laborers is, but with how much he can play with it. So quickly, I want to read a small paragraph of what he was posted on Guernica when the book was being launched 6 years ago. And it's beautiful.
This is my favorite story in Temporary.
It's beautiful. In a labor camp somewhere in the Persian Gulf, a laborer swallowed his passport and turned into a passport. His roommate swallowed a suitcase and turned into a little suitcase. When the third roommate, privy and entitled to the master plan, ran away the next morning with the suitcase and the new passport, he made it past the guard on night duty, made it on the morning bus to the airport, past the board ticket agent at check-in, past security, past pat down and rummaging through his suitcase, past using the bathroom once, twice, thrice, to pee, to shit, to sit, past duty-free where he stared at chocolates and booze and magazines and currencies, past families eating fast food in tracksuits or designer wear, past men and women sleeping on the floor, past his present, past the gold in the souks, the cranes in the sky, petrol in the air, dreams in his head, past God and the devil, the smell of mess halls, past humidity and hot air, past it all, until he found an empty chair in the departures lounge where he. It's a really incredible sentence. Really, I think there is so much power in this opening kind of paragraph that really pushes you and makes you run with them and stop your breath. And it's an experience that almost all of us go through when we travel, but the differences of class and caste and who you are changes that very same experience of even going through duty-free or security. And I think that he's employed a certain way of writing, which is really kind of beautiful and mesmerizing. I'm quickly, because of time, going to move on faster. The third example is now Lantin Shear, who was Lee, who was, also on the state. He has now written about Deepak Onikrishnan and this book, and it's a report for Art Asia Pacific, and I'm just going to read the first paragraph. Deepak Onikrishnan is a writer from Abu Dhabi whose work has fundamentally shaped the contours of my thinking and whose ethics have taught me how to practice and how to belong. He is one of maybe 6 or 7 people I imagine when I think of the people for whom I make things and to whom those things are dedicated. We met, as kids from the Emirates often do, elsewhere in Chicago. We were both studying some years ago. Our first conversation lasted damn near half a day. And in that conversation, Deepak articulated affectionately the timber and fictions of this place we call home in a way that I had then only begun to find words for. So in these 3 really kind of wonderful examples, I've now looked at one Arab, one Chinese, and one South Indian. Their location is UAE. They're telling their stories without kind of really digging into any typical tropes, but telling the same experience from different angles. One is writing for an essay for a journal, one is writing a fiction book, and one is doing a report for a paper. So I think this is like a very quick jet set way of kind of exploring how these things were kind of done. I'm going to skip through my work because I don't think it's important. So I'm just going to move through that. And I'm just going to end with this picture, which, it kind of is one of my favorite books, Dune. And so I don't know if people will recognize Litany Against Fear, but something that I learned from the workshop, and something that I think more so than anything I return to fear, is that it controls too much of what we do. And so I reference one of my favorite books. In it, a litany against fear was spoken by many highly educated people who face danger or fear during their everyday lives. The litany helped focus their minds in times of peril. The most well-known line from it is, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. I will end with this. There is joy in writing, and there's also extreme discomfort. Sometimes it's business, and sometimes it's not. But what I hope that this session kind of inspired into thinking is, what does writing mean to you? Thank you.
Saira, thank you so much. You are going to have to go back to your work because the questions directed at you will draw you back. And really, thank you for the examples and really speaking about, the practicalities of it, but also things that we don't often discuss. And I think it's that medium of sitting with a text, like investing that time in it, which oftentimes here, specifically in the UAE, we don't have. We're constrained to our art seasons and our deadlines and just how things move. And so the first question we have for you is, how do you manage your own expectations of yourself as a writer? And how do you keep yourself focused on your goals as a writer? The second is your writer's block routine. So what do you do when you're faced with all those blocks?
So before I start answering, should I stop sharing the screen and return to kind of, so I can see people that I'm talking to?
You won't be able to see anybody, unfortunately, but
excellent. Okay, that's fine. I'll just leave it till here. But can people see me? Okay, so I think answering those 2 questions, I live daily with imposter syndrome. I literally tell myself every day, I am faking this. It's really hard. It's really hard. Okay, not daily anymore. I've been working very hard on changing that about myself. But it stuck with me for a very long time because I have always been around people who've had a better education, who've had more experiences, who've worked harder. And I always struggle with that. And what I've learned to do is separate my imposter syndrome with my writing. I can still continue to think that I'm crap all, but I realized that it shouldn't stop me from writing. The only thing that it's hindered me in doing is that for the last 15 years, I've been writing. And when it comes to professional text, whether it's reviews or essays or books or being a managing editor, I'm extremely confident about that. I don't really have, I'm totally fine with sharing that. I have links on my website. But when it comes to my personal writing, I struggle with that. And it's something that I'm addressing. I've been working on a text that I want to publish for the last few months, one paragraph at a time. So I struggle, which is why I think this conversation from me to you is not so much as me teaching or preaching, but sharing peer-to-peer experiences of how I tackle them.
Saira, someone's asking if you shift the slides to your writing so we can look at your writing and hear you speak at the same time.
Okay, so this is this particular slide is an example of something that I just did for a book that I am a managing editor on. It's published by Sharjah Art Foundation and Morel Books. Omar Khalif's new book, which is Art in the Age of Anxiety. I initially started as a managing editor, but the more our conversations developed, he wanted me to contribute a piece. And I write, people who know my personal writing know that I write a lot about grief. And this particular essay is about writing in the grief in the age of technology. And what I did here, I don't know if you want me to read this out, or it's a small note, and it says, I love cats a lot, and the internet is a wonderful place for people like me. There exists a cat picture, video, GIF, and emoji for every possible situation, response, argument, mood. And when you don't look for it or someone doesn't send it to you, the helpful algorithm will always suggest something new that I haven't chanced upon. In the follow-up to my mother's death and upon returning to my real life and job, condolences had to shift gear. And so began the cat GIF beam outreach from so many. Strangely enough, this was welcome. Someone made the effort to look up the appropriate internet cat. Funny, but not flippant. Cute, but concerned. Making eye contact and telling me this love is all for you and in recognition of your loss. But also, look, I run into walls. And so this was very much my experience of grief. But as a footnote, I decided to put in the pushing cat because that was what people were sending me. And I was discussing with Omar, and he's a very serious editor, but he's also very open to playfulness. And I said, my end notes are going to be cat emojis. And he's like, well, if that's what you're referencing, then it works. And I think it takes pushing that when you're realizing it's a book distributed by MIT Press, really. That would be the first thing to make you stop. And I think it was worth asking the question, can I please put cats in my endnotes?
I mean, that goes back to this idea of looking at text and pages as a canvas, right? And being able to push those boundaries. And actually, a few questions around that are coming in. So one is thoughts on text that accompany an imagery. So thinking of what a caption does, how do you keep it relevant, informative, specific, and yet how can you also keep it interesting? Especially because an image is worth 1,000 words anyway. So what do those few extra words do in terms of framing? And yeah, this is basically a question about approaching captions.
Well, so it's very important to know where the caption is being shared. If the caption is going into an exhibition catalog, obviously there are certain standards whoever you're working with would be following. A caption would simply be the title, the year, the medium, the kind of size. If there's a descriptive caption, this usually in the case of, for instance, Sharjah Art Foundation, when we have biennials, we have these descriptive captions next to work. They differ from people to people and what they need to include. It comes down to how much you want to give away with that work. Sometimes works need description, or sometimes work have history that needs to be presented with the work. then you kind of present that. Other times, I would feel it becomes a lot of hand holding and it doesn't need to be there. But know again where you're sharing it and who your intended audience is. If it's for a completely mass audience that is coming to a public museum, you may have to share more information. If you're doing it specifically for your peer groups, there is very little that you need to talk about. I believe in always, I believe in saying less, but it changes from place to place. But I feel like sometimes it's very easy to look up online on what industry standards are. I can't even express enough how much you should read. And I don't mean read very like philosophy and theory. Read whatever, but read what you want to correct in your own work. So if you're interested in captions, look up exhibition catalogs, pick them up, see what works, what doesn't. And what happens is not about just educating yourself, it's about developing an opinion and whether you think it's right or wrong.
And so the next question, it also ties in with the writer's block, which someone had asked earlier. So how can you begin writing for publications if you've not had prior experience in getting published? So what are your tips on developing a writing portfolio? What should that look like?
Okay, so there's two kind of things. There's one, where to start and how to get published. I think one of the ways that I started was that I started with a very infamous blog where I used to rant and be a complete ass. But I chose my own platform because I wanted to write. But what happens is that I think it's very interesting to start pitching, writing reviews. And if that's not something you're comfortable with, then writing reports. So you can report on exhibitions without necessarily having your review. Or you can start pitching essays. Publications, print, online are always looking for pitches. Trust me, if there is something interesting, they will talk to you. I know, speaking specifically about Pakistan, it becomes very hard because there are a few people who are doing all the writing. But I feel in the past few years, there's some incredible writers that have come up who have been writing on different platforms, both in terms of art writing and fiction, or, I think it would be worth reaching out to them. A lot of them are very friendly people. Things like go on to that particular publication or website, look up these people, or I'm happy for you to email me to ask me about tips. I've not been very helpful. I know that a few people have reached out, but I just share personal experiences, but I don't have any wasta where I can directly connect you to people. But it means putting yourself out. So pitch, start writing. If you're very, very eager to write, start your own blog, start publishing these things. Eventually, people will pick up that you're a writer and will start reaching out to you themselves.
And Saira, offering writing services as well. There's so many of us that are stuck with knowing how to edit, as you said, or needing that refreshing opinion. So I think that's a place to start as well, supporting your friends, collaborators, peers on how your writing and your text can complement them too.
Absolutely. I think both in UAE and Pakistan, two of the areas that I've spent the most time in now, I've seen a lot more on-ground effort by people working together rather than relying on people to, publish for them if they're not able to get that avenue. So there's a lot of collectives who put together either zines or newsletters or art projects or performances or happenings. I have seen a lot of this coming up in Lahore and Islamabad, for instance. I may be out of touch, but I do feel that energy. And I think it is about going the extra mile. If you want your text to reach an audience, you go the extra mile. If you want to write because you just enjoy writing, you don't have to really do all of that also. You can go back and forth. There are no real strict laws, but like we tell artists, really, if you're not going to exhibitions and museums and galleries around you in the city, then that's a shame, because I don't know what you're proving. It's just being with what's happening and being off the time and seeing and having an opinion of liking and disliking. Same it is writing. You need to connect to people and find those networks and audiences, and you really need to make the push. But don't expect to make money out of it. No, well, you can, but yeah.
I mean, look, there are avenues in it, Saira. It's so mastering the art of storytelling can go so many ways, even if it's not writing. there are opportunities in presenting and again, collaborating, accompanying somebody else, supporting someone else. And the question we also have, are there any texts from literature that have influenced your writing? And this is an important one because, you know, you said this more than once, and this is a reminder to all of us, we were not ever native English speakers. We all suffer from this imposter syndrome of not having had this education or feeling a little bit behind when we did have privileged educations, but felt very behind as writers.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that science fiction has been a very big influence on my writing. But I was reading very, very straightforward, white male, turn of the kind of Cold War science fiction. And I loved Arthur C. Clarke and all of those writers. And I think a lot of what I write, so I don't know, I connected to that. Even when I write about grief, I think about the future, I think about the present, and I think about how we are in a certain time frame. How I kind of tried to hone it was, I started looking for persons of color who were writing about science fiction. And African futurism was something that I somehow very deeply connected with the Desi culture, also about writing about very much your cultural roots kind of coming into science fiction, which we think of these NASA spaceships only, and we don't think of them coming out of a remote kind of desert land in the middle of the continent in Africa. I think so. That's what I chose to take from the text that I read. I read a lot of weird stuff, but lately I think I've been reading stuff online with contemporary writers, and it's really blowing my mind away what people are writing. I don't think one should consider that as cheating. I think it should be considered as learning, when you learn from your peers.
Thank you so much for that, Saira. I also wanted to say that Saira will be providing a toolkit that will be available to all of you, and hopefully you'll be able to address and list some of these references. Any exercises and prompts that you have as well would be great. Any examples also of looking at art making and book making in a sense, or page making.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of things from the workshop that I realized should be included in the toolkit. So I'm glad that's going to be available to everybody, and hope it can help somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you so much for this, Saira, and thank you to everybody for your questions and your concerns around writing. And so there's a question, Yara. So the toolkit and this recorded session will be available as soon as possible. We're compiling everything together, but Saira and us will discuss deadlines shortly. So don't worry, they will be there as quickly as possible. Once again, Saira, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and we hope to have more opportunities to work with you and collaborate with you as a writer and more.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Ciao.